The air of Savannah in 1836 was thick with the scent of magnolias and misery. The streets whispered with the rhythm of carriage wheels, and beneath every polite smile of the southern elite, there was a secret buried deep in the soil that had drunk too much blood. That year, Georgia was prospering. Cotton was king and human lives were its currency. Among the proud, sun-soaked plantations that stretched beyond the river, one house stood out, not for its beauty, but for the silence that surrounded it. Locals called it the widow's house. A grand, white-columned mansion with ivy creeping up its walls, standing just beyond the city's edge. And inside that house lived a woman whose name people spoke only in whispers. Some said she was cursed. Some said she had made a deal with the devil. Others just refused to speak at all. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, the widow of Savannah. She had once been a beautiful woman, admired at church gatherings, known for her grace and charm. Her husband, Jonathan Whitmore, had been a wealthy plantation owner, stern but respected. Together, they had built an empire of cotton and cruelty. When Jonathan died suddenly, some said of fever, others of a poisoned drink, Eleanor changed. The charm remained, but the warmth was gone. In its place came ambition, a cold, quiet ambition that looked like grief on the surface but hid something darker underneath. Eleanor inherited everything: the land, the workers, the debt, and the pressure to keep the business thriving. In that world, a woman alone was seen as weak, vulnerable. But Eleanor was not like other women. She understood the power of appearance. She wore black not only as a widow's mourning but as armor. Her eyes, once soft, turned sharp. Her words, once gentle, became commands. She became known for her ability to manage men, traders, bankers, and even preachers, without ever raising her voice. But what people didn't know was that Eleanor had found a new way to sustain her fortune. Something that went beyond the fields, beyond the cotton, beyond morality itself. It started quietly. After her husband's death, profits began to slip. The cotton yield was lower, the prices unpredictable. Slave traders demanded more workers, younger bodies, stronger arms. Buying new slaves from auctions had become expensive. Eleanor, desperate to protect her wealth, began to study the slave ledgers. She noticed something: the most profitable plantations weren't those that bought, but those that bred. They treated human life like livestock, pairing men and women for birth, selling their children for profit. It was a practice whispered about in the dark corners of taverns, hidden from polite society, but it was real. And soon, Eleanor decided she would not just follow that system, she would perfect it. At first, she paired the enslaved women with selected men, choosing by height, strength, and fertility. But when she saw how quickly profits came, her greed deepened. She wanted more control. She wanted children born of beauty, light-skinned, fair, featured, the kind that fetched a higher price in the markets of New Orleans and Charleston. And to achieve that, she turned to the only people she could control absolutely: her own daughters. Mary, the eldest, was 17, quiet, obedient, the kind of girl who always kept her eyes down in church. Lydia, the younger, was 15, spirited, curious, too bold for her mother's comfort. Their father's death had left them fragile, and their mother's coldness left them terrified. They lived under her watch like prisoners in silk dresses. And as time passed, they began to understand that their mother's love came with conditions. Eleanor began inviting certain men to the estate. Traders, foremen, investors. The girls were told to serve tea, to smile, to entertain. But what began as innocent hospitality soon turned sinister. The men stayed longer, the doors closed, and the girls learned that in their mother's house, their bodies were no longer their own. In the beginning, the town whispered. Some servants fled and carried tales into Savannah, tales of the widow's daughters, of strange cries at night, of children born who disappeared before they could walk. But in a city built on silence, whispers fade fast. The church accepted Eleanor's donations, the sheriff enjoyed her dinners, and the slaves on her land knew better than to speak. There was one girl, a housemaid named Ruth, who once tried to run. She had seen too much. A newborn taken from the eldest daughter's arms, sold to a trader before the mother's tears had even dried. Ruth ran through the swamps, barefoot, until she reached a neighboring plantation. But by dawn she was caught and brought back. Eleanor did not whip her. No, she was too clever for that. She simply smiled, took Ruth by the hand, and led her inside. The next day Ruth's body was found by the river, her throat cut, her eyes open to the sky. After that, no one ever ran again. Eleanor's daughters stopped speaking to each other. Mary grew pale and thin, her once bright eyes hollow. Lydia grew wild, angry, defiant, sometimes locking herself in her room for days. The servants said they heard her crying at night, whispering prayers to a God she no longer believed was listening. And yet, life went on, the cotton grew, the ships came and went. The widow of Savannah smiled her polite smile at church every Sunday, dressed in fine lace and pearls, her gloved hands folded neatly as she bowed her head in prayer. Behind her sat her daughters, silent, pale as ghosts. No one dared ask questions. Not the preacher, not the neighbors, not even the men who traded with her. Because everyone in Savannah knew that money had a way of silencing morality. The widow's wealth poured into the town, into its schools, its church bells, its marble courtyards. And so the city stayed blind. There were nights, though, when the sound of crying could be heard from that great white house, carried by the wind across the fields. The slaves said the spirits of the unborn roamed there, seeking mothers who could no longer speak. They said Eleanor Whitmore had sold not only her children's innocence, but her soul. One night, a storm rolled over Savannah. The wind tore at the shutters, the trees bent low. Inside the mansion, candles flickered and died. The thunder shook the walls, and somewhere deep inside, a door slammed. Lydia was seen running through the hallway, her dress torn, her hair wet, screaming her sister's name. But Mary did not answer. When morning came, Mary was gone. Eleanor told the townsfolk that her eldest had gone to visit relatives in Charleston. But no one had seen her leave. No carriage was sent, no letter arrived. Lydia, from that day on, never spoke again. The widow of Savannah carried on as if nothing had happened. Her wealth grew, but her house grew quieter. The laughter that once echoed in the halls had vanished. The mirrors were covered, the curtains drawn. Some nights, the neighbors swore they saw her wandering the fields with a lantern, searching for something, or someone, among the rows of cotton. Years later, when she too disappeared, the house stood empty. The vines overtook the porch, the shutters rotted, and the legend began. They said the cries of young women could still be heard when the wind passed through the old plantation. They said the ground itself rejected peace. Savannah moved on. The world forgot her name. But in dusty archives and yellowed letters fragments remain, records of births with no mothers listed, sales of children whose bloodline was never traced. The widow of Savannah was never punished, never tried, never named in any official record. Her evil hid behind wealth, behind respectability, behind a smile that history refused to question. And yet every story leaves a shadow. Those who visit the outskirts of the old plantation say that at dusk, when the sun bleeds into the river, the air turns colder. The cicadas fall silent, and if you listen closely you can hear a woman's voice, whispering through the trees, calling the names of her daughters. Mary, Lydia. Marry Lydia over and over, until the sound fades into the night. Maybe it's guilt that refuses to die. Maybe it's the memory of a mother who traded her soul for survival. Or maybe it's something darker, the echo of a secret that Savannah still keeps, buried deep in its golden soil. Whatever it is, the widow of Savannah still walks. After Mary vanished, the house of the widow grew quieter, but the silence wasn't peace. It was heavy, suffocating, the kind of silence that presses on the chest until you forget how to breathe. The servants moved like shadows, afraid to meet one another's eyes. The fields still filled with the songs of the enslaved, but even those songs had changed. They were lower now, slower, like prayers for mercy that never came. Lydia wandered the corridors like a ghost. Her eyes no longer met her mother's. Her lips no longer formed words. At night, she'd sit by the window of her sister's empty room, clutching one of Mary's ribbons, staring out toward the dark fields that stretched beyond the trees. The same fields where hundreds of men and women worked from dawn till the stars faded, their sweat feeding the fortune of the woman in black. Eleanor Whitmore, the widow of Savannah, had lost one daughter, but she had not lost her resolve. In fact, the loss only hardened her. If Mary's disappearance weighed on her, she never showed it. She attended church every Sunday, donated to the poor, and hosted evening dinners for Savannah's elite. Her name carried weight again. The city's merchants, judges, and even preachers spoke of her as a woman of admirable strength, a widow who had survived tragedy and continued to uphold her husband's legacy. None of them cared to ask what that legacy truly was. Behind the white columns of her mansion, Eleanor's empire grew. The breeding of slaves, that quiet, unspoken economy, became the lifeblood of her estate. She had learned every trick of the trade. She selected the strongest men, measured their height and muscle, inspected the women for fertility as if they were livestock. She kept meticulous records in a leather-bound book locked in her office, a book no one was allowed to touch. Each page listed names, ages, dates of birth, and in the margins, the prices those children could fetch. In the world of the South, there was no greater sin than weakness, and no greater virtue than profit. Eleanor knew both. Her neighbors envied her success, but feared her presence. When she walked through town, people greeted her with polite smiles, but mothers clutched their children's hands a little tighter. There was something in her eyes, cold, calculating, something that made even the boldest men look away. But the story of the widow wasn't just one of greed. It was one of blood, because what she had begun in her fields had now seeped into her family's veins. Lydia, the last daughter, became her mother's new project. Eleanor watched her closely, with a possessive kind of love, a love that was never gentle, never nurturing. It was the love of a woman who saw her child not as flesh and blood, but as a means to an end. Eleanor's plan was cruelly simple. She had noticed how traders spoke of beauty, how fair skin and delicate features could double a price. Mulatto, they called it, as if it were a brand of luxury, and so she made her decision. She would continue what she had begun with Mary. Lydia would bear the children that would secure her fortune. The men who visited the plantation came under many guises: business partners, inspectors, distant cousins of her late husband. But they all had one thing in common: money. Eleanor's hospitality was famous. Her wine was imported, her table draped in fine lace, her music soft and elegant. And when the evening grew late, she would invite her guests to stay. One by one they did. Lydia tried to resist. The first time she ran, she hid among the cotton rows, barefoot, trembling, praying that someone, anyone, would hear her. But before dawn, the overseer found her. He didn't touch her, he didn't need to. He simply lifted her by the arm and brought her back to her mother's door. Eleanor waited inside, her expression calm, her hands folded. "My child," she said, her voice as smooth as silk, "you will do as I ask, because you are a Whitmore, and a Whitmore woman must always do what is necessary." Lydia screamed that she was not her mother. She said she would rather die than live under her rule. But Eleanor only smiled. "You will one day," she whispered. "And when you do, you'll understand that everything I've done, every choice, every sin was for you." That night Lydia stopped fighting. She retreated inward, her eyes empty, her body moving as though she were trapped in a dream she couldn't wake from. Months later, a child was born. A boy, pale skin, grey eyes, the kind of child who would fetch a high price in Charleston. Eleanor did not weep when she saw him. She simply called for her accountant. Lydia did not speak for 3 days. On the 4th, she tried to throw herself into the river. The servants pulled her out, but something inside her died that night. Meanwhile, Eleanor's business flourished. Her reputation as a breeder spread quietly among traders. They came from all across Georgia and beyond, not just to buy but to learn. They admired her efficiency, her records, her management, her profits. They called her the Widow of Gold, a title she wore like a crown. No one dared call her a monster. In their eyes, she was simply successful. The city of Savannah turned its gaze away. The preachers preached about God's will. The lawyers drafted contracts that disguised human suffering behind elegant words: servitude, labor, domestic help. Each phrase erased the screams that echoed in the night. But those who lived on the estate, the enslaved men and women who tilled her soil and birthed her profits, they knew. They saw the blood on her hands. They whispered to one another about the curse of the widow. They said that the ground itself had begun to reject her, that crops near the mansion turned black, that the well water ran bitter. One old man, a field worker named Samuel, once told the others, "Ain't no riches come without blood." And that woman, she'd drink in too much of it. No one dared repeat his words aloud. Days later, Samuel vanished. Some said he escaped. Others said Eleanor made an example of him. Lydia's son grew fast. Eleanor kept him close, dressed him well, educated him in reading and manners. She told the neighbors he was a distant cousin's child sent for care, but Lydia could barely look at him. When he laughed, she turned away. When he cried, she wept in silence. The boy was both her child and her wound. Eleanor, meanwhile, grew older but not weaker. Her power in Savannah was unmatched. She lent money to judges, supplied labor to merchants, and funded the expansion of the church that blessed her sins. She had built her empire upon her daughters' bodies, upon the children born in secret, upon the silence of those who feared her. But the past has a way of whispering back. There came a night when Lydia awoke to the sound of footsteps, soft, steady, coming from the corridor outside her room. She opened her door and saw her mother walking, holding a candle, murmuring to herself. Eleanor's eyes were far away, unfocused, as if she was speaking to someone who wasn't there. "Mary," she whispered. "Mary, I did it all for you. You'll understand, you will." Lydia followed her down the hall to her mother's study. The door was slightly open. On the desk lay the leather-bound book, the Ledger of Lives. Lydia stepped closer and opened it. The candlelight flickered over the pages, names, numbers, and small notes written in her mother's neat, cold handwriting. And then she found it, her own name, Lydia Whitmore, written beside the word productive. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned another page and saw her son's name. Beside it, a number, a price. The candle fell from her hand and rolled across the floor. Eleanor turned sharply, her face pale in the flickering light. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Eleanor said quietly, "Now you see, my darling, this is what keeps us alive." Lydia's voice broke. "Live? You call this life?" Eleanor's tone did not waver. "Survival is not about happiness, Lydia. It is about power. It is about control. The world takes everything from women like us, unless we learn to take it back." Lydia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You didn't take it back, Mother. You just became them." That night, the storm returned to Savannah. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder rolled across the fields. And as lightning flashed, the widow of Savannah stood in her doorway, watching the sky, her black dress clinging to her thin frame. She looked like a shadow carved from stone. The slaves said that night marked a turning point. They said the river rose higher than ever before, swallowing part of the lower field. Some said it was the earth trying to cleanse itself. Others said it was the spirits of the lost children returning. By morning, the ledger was gone. Some claimed Lydia burned it before fleeing. Others whispered that Eleanor hid it somewhere deep beneath the house, buried with the bones of her sins. What is certain is this: after that night, nothing in the widow's house was ever the same. The fields began to fail. The traders stopped visiting. The servants disappeared, one by one, and Lydia was never seen again. But the story didn't end there, because the bloodlines the widow created, those children born of greed and control, they lived on. They were sold, moved, scattered across states. They carried the color of her sin in their eyes and the silence of their mothers in their bones. And long after Eleanor Whitmore's name was forgotten, her curse remained, not written in books, but in blood. They say that in the ruins of her plantation, when the wind moves just right, you can still hear her whispering, not in pride, not in power, but in regret, calling the names of those she used, those she lost, those who never had a chance to be free. Some sins do not die, they wait. By the time the year turned to 1838, the widow of Savannah had built a fortress of silence around herself. The great house still stood above the river, its white paint weathered and grey, its once bustling halls echoing with emptiness. The town whispered that misfortune had finally found her, that her crops had failed, that her daughters were gone, that God's punishment had begun. But what the people did not know was that Eleanor Whitmore had already found a way to protect her empire from collapse. Where most people saw loss, she saw opportunity. She began spending long hours in her study behind the tall oak doors that no servant dared to open. Inside, she worked by candlelight, surrounded by stacks of papers, bills of sale, contracts, and letters written in fine, looping script. She no longer needed the fields to survive, she needed only her mind. And her mind, sharp as a blade, had discovered the most profitable business of all secrecy. It started with the ledgers, the same ones Lydia had found before she vanished. Each line was a record of transaction, a trace of humanity reduced to ink. But Eleanor's genius was not in keeping records. It was in what she did with them. She began copying certain pages, sending them by courier to men in Charleston, Montgomery, and New Orleans. She used a false name, E. Harland. Her letters spoke of shipments, contracts, investments. They never used the word slave. The men who received those letters understood perfectly. They were traders, bankers, and planters, men who wore fine suits and spoke of virtue while their fortunes were built on chains. To them, Eleanor's records were gold. They showed which plantations produced the strongest workers, which women bore the most children, which families could be broken for the highest return. It was information, data as they called it, and in a world built on control, information was more valuable than cotton. Soon, the widow's name spread quietly across the South's secret networks of trade. Men came to her not to buy, but to learn. They sought her counsel in discreet meetings. Late at night, behind the heavy curtains of her parlor, she would pour them wine, smile with the calm confidence of a queen, and listen to their worries about debts, droughts, and disobedience. And then she would give them advice that chilled the soul. Control begins in the mind. She told one man, a plantation owner from Alabama, break the body and the spirit follows. But if you can shape the spirit first, you never need the whip. He left her house that night pale and silent. Weeks later, his profits doubled. Eleanor's system spread like an infection. She called it the method. And though no one ever wrote her name beside it, everyone in that circle knew who had created it. Her influence reached the docks of Savannah, where ships came in carrying chains and left carrying sugar and gold. It reached the state legislature, where lawmakers passed bills that strengthened ownership and erased guilt. Savannah thrived, and in its prosperity, it forgot. The widow's wealth returned, but her house did not come back to life. Servants still tended to her, but they avoided her gaze. The laughter that once filled the corridors was replaced by the scratching of her pen against paper. Some nights, she could be seen from the window, sitting in her study until dawn, her candle burning long after the rest of the house had gone dark. It was said that she spoke aloud while she worked, not to anyone living, but to her dead husband, to her lost daughters, perhaps even to herself. "Do you see now, Jonathan?" she would whisper. "You left me no choice. You left me nothing but this world, and I learned to rule it." There was one man who dared to question her. Reverend Daniel Mercer, a young preacher who had recently come to Savannah from the north. He was earnest, naive, and full of the kind of faith that does not survive long in places built on sin. He had heard the rumors about the widow, about the missing daughters and the strange dealings at her estate, and he felt it his duty to confront her. He came one Sunday afternoon uninvited, walking up the long drive with a Bible in his hand and sweat on his brow. The house loomed before him, silent and grand. When Eleanor received him, she was dressed in mourning black as always, her silver hair pinned neatly, her expression unreadable. "Reverend Mercer," she said with a faint smile, "you're far from your congregation." "I came," he replied carefully, "to speak of redemption." "Redemption," she repeated, almost amused. "And whose redemption would that be?" He hesitated. "Yours, ma'am, and perhaps this town's." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the air from his lungs. Then Eleanor rose from her chair, her movements deliberate, graceful. She walked to the window, looking out toward the fields. "You speak like a man who believes the world can be cleansed with words," she said softly. "Tell me, Reverend, have you ever seen a man hanged? Have you ever watched a woman lose everything because she was born without the right to own her own name?" He swallowed hard. "Suffering is not justification for cruelty, Mrs. Whitmore." At that she turned, her eyes sharp as glass. "Cruelty," she whispered. "Cruelty is what they did to me, what they do to every woman who dares to survive in this world. I did what I must. I used the only power they left me, the power to play their game better than they ever could." The Reverend tried to speak again, but the words died on his tongue. There was something in her presence, a force that made him feel small, almost childlike. He left the house shaken, convinced he had spoken to a soul beyond salvation. And yet, that night he prayed for her. As months passed, the widow's influence grew darker still. Her contracts reached across state lines. She began lending money to smaller plantations in exchange for a portion of their future assets. In plain words, the children yet unborn. It was business disguised as mercy. When some of those plantations failed, Eleanor quietly took ownership. One by one, pieces of Georgia's countryside came under her control until her map of power stretched far beyond Savannah. But power has a way of eating its master. The same networks she had built began to turn against her. Her partners, men who had once called her genius, began to fear that she knew too much. She held their secrets in her ledgers, their names beside crimes that could destroy them. They started sending fewer letters, then none at all. One night, a carriage arrived at her gate. Inside sat two men she did not recognize. Polite, well-dressed, smiling too easily. They brought papers for her to sign, claiming to represent a new trading company. She invited them in, poured them wine, and listened. Their words were smooth, their offer generous, but Eleanor had lived long enough to recognize deceit. When they left, she burned the papers. By morning, her barn was on fire. The flames devoured half the fields before the rain came. The slaves fought to save what they could, but by dawn, the air was thick with ash. From her balcony, Eleanor watched the smoke rise, her expression blank. She knew what the fire meant. The men she had outsmarted were now warning her, reminding her that in the world of power, loyalty was only as strong as fear. After the fire, she grew reclusive. Her health declined, though her mind remained sharp. She dismissed most of her servants, keeping only two, an old cook named Martha and a young boy named Ely, who had once been a child in her records but now worked as her assistant. Ely was quiet but observant. He watched her work, copying her letters, sealing them, sending them to addresses she never explained. Sometimes he found her asleep at her desk, her hands still clutching her pen. Other times, she'd stare at the wall for hours, as if she could see ghosts walking through it. One evening, Eli asked her, "Mum, why do you still write if nobody writes you back?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "Because silence," she said, "is not the same as forgiveness." That night, Ely went into town and told a friend what he had seen: boxes of papers, sealed envelopes, and a small iron key that Eleanor wore around her neck. Within weeks, that story spread. Some said the boxes held money. Others said they held evidence of every sin committed in Savannah. People began to fear her again, not because of her power, but because of what she might reveal. In her final months, the widow of Savannah was more ghost than woman. She wandered her empty house by candlelight, her black dresses hanging loose on her thin frame. Sometimes she spoke to the air, calling the names of those long gone: Mary, Lydia, Jonathan. Sometimes she laughed softly, as if someone had whispered a secret in her ear. And then, one morning, she was gone. The servants found the front door open, her candle still burning on the table, the chair beside it empty. The iron key was gone from around her neck. Her ledgers, too, had vanished. Searchers combed the estate for days. They found no body, no sign of struggle, only her footprints leading down toward the riverbank, and then nothing. The river carried many things in those days: driftwood, debris, memory, but it never gave the widow back. Years later, when the house fell to ruin, a group of workers discovered a sealed chest beneath the floorboards of her study. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, bound with ribbon and sealed in wax. Each bore a different name, each one a confession. No one dared read them aloud. And yet somehow their existence was enough. Savannah began to change slowly, uneasily, as though trying to wash its hands of her legacy. The name Eleanor Whitmore faded from the records, struck out from history. But her shadow remained, in the contracts that built fortunes, in the streets that carried her money, in the quiet shame that the city never spoke of again. Some say that at the edge of the old plantation, when fog drifts from the river at dawn, you can still see her figure, a woman in black, standing with her head bowed, as if listening to something only she can hear. Maybe it's the sound of the river calling her home, or maybe it's the whispers of the names she once wrote, calling her to answer, at last, for the secrets she tried to bury. When the widow of Savannah vanished, the world outside her estate moved on as though she had never lived. The papers printed nothing. The merchants spoke of new trade routes, and the preachers spoke of sin without naming hers. The fields along the river slowly swallowed the ruins of her house, vines wrapping around broken columns like hands reclaiming what had been stolen. Yet her story did not die. It lingered in the air like humidity, carried in whispers by those who had worked her land and by those who had bled beneath her rule. And somewhere, far from Savannah, one voice still carried the weight of that name: Lydia. She had left the house the night of the fire, barefoot and shaking, a satchel clutched to her chest. Inside it was a single ribbon, Mary's, and a page torn from her mother's ledger. The road to freedom was not straight. It twisted through swamps and small towns, through the kindness of strangers and the cruelty of those who hunted her. Each step away from the plantation was a battle against fear, but fear was something she had learned to master long ago. By the time she reached the outskirts of Charleston, Lydia had forgotten the sound of her own voice. She lived among other women who carried the same silence, sewing in the daylight and sleeping in a crowded attic at night. They didn't ask about her past, she didn't ask about theirs. But sometimes, when the moonlight caught her face just right, one of them would see the ghost of recognition, the faint resemblance of a woman whose name still caused shivers in the Old South. Lydia tried to build a life that wasn't built on secrets. She worked, she prayed, she even smiled once in a while. Yet the ledger page never left her. She kept it hidden under her mattress, the ink faded but the words still clear. Her name, written in her mother's perfect script, beside a number that defined her worth. She looked at it whenever she felt herself forgetting who she had been. It was her reminder of everything she had escaped, and everything she still carried. Years passed, and with them came rumors. Stories drifted from Savannah like ghosts on the wind that the widow had drowned herself in the river, that she had fled north under a false name, that she still lived, watching from the shadows of her ruined house. Lydia didn't believe any of them. She knew her mother too well. Death, to a woman like Eleanor Whitmore, was never surrender, it was strategy. Still, each rumor made Lydia's heart tremble in that old, familiar rhythm of fear and defiance. One winter, a stranger came to the boarding house where Lydia worked. He was a sailor, his clothes rough, his accent clipped. He asked if anyone knew a woman named Lydia Whitmore. The name hit the air like a spark. Lydia froze, the needle in her hand slipping and pricking her finger. She didn't answer, but the sailor found her later, outside near the washing line. He told her he had come from Savannah, that the widow's estate had finally been sold, the remaining servants scattered, the furniture auctioned off. Among the items was a chest, small, iron-bound, locked tight. The buyers had broken it open, hoping for jewels or money. Inside were letters, hundreds of them. Some were contracts, others were confessions. But one was addressed simply to my daughters. The sailor had not read it. He said he'd been paid to deliver it north, to a church in Charleston. But after hearing her name whispered among the women of the house, he thought perhaps it belonged to her. He handed her a folded envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with dark red wax. The seal bore the Whitmore crest, the mark of a woman who had ruled with ink and silence. Lydia didn't open it that night. She stared at it for hours, her hands trembling, her breath shallow. Part of her wanted to throw it into the fire. Another part, older, colder, wanted to know every word. At dawn she broke the seal. The letter was short. The handwriting was the same she remembered from the ledgers, but weaker, trembling at the edges. My dearest child, if this reaches you, then I am already gone. I do not ask for forgiveness, for I know the weight of my deeds. But know this, I was made by the same world that destroyed you. Everything I built was born of fear, fear of hunger, of men of power. I turned that fear into control, and it consumed us all. The gold is buried where the river bends. Take it, if you can bear it. It will buy your freedom. Or burn it, if you would rather have peace. You were always stronger than I. Perhaps that is my punishment, to know that the only pure thing I ever touched was the child who could not bear to look at me. Eleanor. Lydia read the letter again and again until the words blurred. She wanted to feel anger, but what came instead was sorrow, the kind that settles in your bones and refuses to leave. She folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked it into her satchel beside the ribbon. That night she dreamed of Savannah, of the river gleaming under moonlight, of her mother's figure standing on the bank, whispering something Lydia could not hear. Weeks later Lydia returned. She told no one where she was going. The road was longer this time, overgrown and half forgotten. When she reached the ruins of the plantation, the house was little more than a skeleton of stone and vine. The front doors hung open. The air smelled of earth and memory. She stepped inside, her footsteps stirring dust that glittered in the weak light. Everything was quiet, too quiet, as if the house itself were holding its breath. In the study, where her mother had once written her ledgers, the floorboards were warped and cracked. She found the place where the desk had stood and knelt there. For hours she searched, until her fingers brushed something cold beneath the wood, a small iron key, rusted but still intact. She didn't know what it opened. Perhaps nothing, but she closed her hand around it and whispered, "I forgive you." The words felt strange on her tongue, heavy and freeing at once. Outside, near the bend of the river, she found the old tree where the roots curled like claws. She dug with her hands until the soil gave way. There, half buried in mud, was a wooden box. Inside, not gold but papers, dozens of them, letters written in her mother's hand addressed to men across the South, records of every deal, every betrayal, proof of everything the world had chosen to forget. For a long moment Lydia just stared at them. These were her mother's ghosts, each page a soul sold, each signature a chain forged. She could have burned them, and perhaps she should have, but she thought of the people who had suffered, the families torn apart, the children lost to the trade her mother had helped build. Their stories deserved to be seen, so she carried the papers into town, to the office of the same Reverend Mercer who had once dared to face the widow. He was an old man now, his hair white, his voice soft. When Lydia placed the box on his desk, he looked at her with quiet recognition. "You have her eyes," he said. "She had many eyes," Lydia replied, "but she never saw." The Reverend opened the box, his face tightening as he read the first letter. "These will ruin powerful men." "They should be ruined," she said simply, and so began the unraveling of Savannah's long-kept secret. The letters spread quietly at first, through whispers, through sermons, through the trembling hands of those who had long kept silent. Some called them forgeries, others called them divine justice. Plantations changed hands. Names were struck from church walls, and for the first time, the city began to look at itself. Lydia never stayed to see it. She left again, walking north until the air turned cold and the accent of the people changed. She settled in a small town near the border, where no one knew her name. She taught children to read, to write, to question. Sometimes when they asked about her family, she smiled faintly and said she had once lived by a river that forgot how to sleep. Years later, when the war came and the world began to tear itself apart, Lydia's story became legend, a whisper about a woman who had carried justice in a box of letters. Some said she died peacefully, others that she vanished like her mother. But those who visited the ruins of the old Whitmore plantation swore they sometimes saw two figures walking by the river at dusk, one tall, one slender, both silent, a mother and daughter, finally side by side, watching the water carry their history away. And when the wind moved through the reeds, it sounded almost like forgiveness. Soft, uncertain, but real. The widow of Savannah was gone, her house reclaimed by earth, her empire turned to dust. Yet in that same soil, something else had begun to grow, not wealth, not power, but truth. The ruins of the Whitmore estate never truly disappeared. Nature was patient, and the earth had a way of reclaiming what was stolen from it. Seasons passed, storms swept through Savannah, the river shifted its path, but the bones of that house remained. White columns cracked by ivy, iron gates leaning under the weight of years. Travelers sometimes passed the site and spoke of an uneasy silence, as if the ground itself held its breath. The locals did not speak her name anymore, but they all knew whose land it was. They simply called it the widow's place, a phrase that carried both fear and shame. Lydia had long vanished by then. Some said she died quietly in a northern town, her grave unmarked, her letters scattered. Others believed she had gone west, chasing a horizon where the past couldn't find her. The truth was smaller, simpler. Lydia had learned to live in the quiet. She kept a garden she read by candlelight, and some evenings she would write. Her words were not about her mother, not even about herself. They were about the people history had forgotten. The workers, the women, the nameless children. Each name she wrote was a form of resurrection, each line a rebellion against silence. But Savannah could not forget so easily. The widow's letters had changed everything. Men who had once ruled plantations now lived behind closed shutters. Families who had built their wealth on the trade of flesh found their names whispered in disgust. Yet for every truth that surfaced, there were 10 others buried deeper. People preferred half remembrance to full confession. And so, over time, the story of the widow of Savannah faded into rumor again. Distorted, romanticized, half-true. They made her into a ghost, a legend, a cautionary tale told to frighten young girls. The real woman, and the real pain she caused, were swallowed by the soft machinery of history. Then came the war. Fire rolled through Georgia, burning plantations and pride alike. Soldiers marched across fields where the widow's slaves had once toiled, and the river turned red again, this time with the blood of men fighting to destroy or preserve the same cruel order she had mastered. When it was over, the land was scarred but breathing. The chains were broken, yet the ghosts remained. After the war, Savannah tried to reinvent itself. The city painted over its past with charm and gentility. Tourists came to marvel at its moss-draped oaks, its grand houses, its whispered elegance. They called it beautiful, never asking who had paid for that beauty. But in one corner of the city archives, dusty boxes sat unopened, marked simply 1836 private correspondences. Inside them, the widow's letters waited, patient as bones under soil. A century later, in 1936, a young historian named Evelyn Moore discovered those boxes. She was not from Georgia. She had grown up in Boston, raised on stories of progress and liberty. Savannah to her was an old curiosity, a southern jewel. She came looking for architectural drawings, but what she found were ghosts written in perfect cursive. The first letter she read began, "To my associates in Charleston," and ended with a list of human names priced as property. Her hands trembled. She read another and another, until the ink blurred from tears. The realization hit her slowly that this wasn't just history. This was confession. It was proof that the genteel world she had been taught to admire was built upon cruelty dressed in lace. Evelyn spent weeks in that archive. She pieced together the widow's empire, her transactions, her language. The widow wrote about people as if they were ingredients, her daughters as if they were currency. But in the later letters, Evelyn found something stranger. Notes that didn't sound like business. Sentences heavy with guilt. Mentions of the river, and the fire. The tone shifted from arrogance to dread, as if the woman who had once ruled everything was now haunted by the weight of it all. Evelyn became obsessed. She traveled to the ruins of the estate, which were now tangled with oak and vine. Standing there, she felt the strange hum of memory, as though the air itself carried the residue of suffering. She knelt by the broken columns and brushed her fingers through the soil, imagining the people who had lived and died there. That night in her notes, she wrote, "This land remembers." She published her research 2 years later, under the title The Widow of Savannah, a forgotten crime of the Old South. The book caused a storm. Some called it slander, others called it revelation. In the North, it was praised as brave scholarship. In the South, it was treated like a curse unearthed. The descendants of Savannah's oldest families denounced her. Churches refused to carry the book. But the silence had been broken, and in the shadows of that broken silence, something long denied began to breathe again: truth. Among those who read Evelyn's book was a young black teacher named Samuel Whitfield. He recognized a name buried deep in one of the letters: his great-grandmother's. For years his family had told stories of a woman who escaped a plantation fire, who carried a small iron key and a page from a ledger. Her name, they said, was Lydia. The world had forgotten her, but her blood had not. Samuel kept her story alive in classrooms, in church meetings, in whispered tales told under starlight. He did not know if the widow was his ancestor's captor or her mother, and he did not care. What mattered was that Lydia had survived. In 1965, during the height of the civil rights movement, Samuel stood before a crowd on the steps of Savannah's courthouse. In his hand was Evelyn's book, worn from years of reading. "History," he said, "is not just what we inherit, it's what we choose to carry." Behind him, protesters held signs demanding justice, equality, truth. For a moment, the ghosts of the past seemed to lean forward, listening, and somewhere, perhaps, the widow listened too. Time moved forward again, as it always does. The world grew louder, faster, more forgetful. The house by the river finally collapsed in a storm in 1989. All that remained were fragments of tile and the stone threshold of the door. But people still came. Historians, tourists, dreamers. Some claimed to feel a chill when they stood there at dusk, a whisper that moved with the wind, a voice that said nothing clearly yet filled them with a strange, aching sorrow. In the early 2000s, a museum was built in Savannah, dedicated to telling the truth of the region's past. In one dimly lit room there stood a glass case. Inside it were 3 objects: a page from a ledger, a child's ribbon, and a small iron key. The plaque beneath them read simply, "The Widow and Her Daughters, Savannah 1836. There was no mention of horror, no sensational story, just those objects, quiet as prayer. Visitors would often stand there longer than at any other exhibit. Some cried. Some bowed their heads. Some whispered words no one could hear. What they felt was not fear but recognition, that history was not something far away, but something living within them. That every story buried by silence still waits for someone brave enough to listen. And in that silence, the widow's empire finally dissolved. Not through vengeance, not through fire, but through remembrance. Truth had done what punishment could not. Every year on the anniversary of the fire, the museum curator, a woman named Angela Moore, great-granddaughter of Evelyn, would walk down to the riverbank. She would scatter white petals on the water and read from Lydia's writings, preserved in fragments passed through generations. Her favorite line was always the same: "Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is remembering without becoming the thing that hurt you." The river carried the petals away, just as it had carried the ashes long ago. The wind moved through the reeds, and if you stood there long enough, you might think you saw two shadows standing side by side. A woman in a widow's shawl, another younger, her face calm and clear. They did not speak. They only watched the water, as if guarding it, as if ensuring that the past would never again be hidden beneath its surface. The story of the Widow of Savannah ended not with her death, but with her unmasking. In the end, she was neither monster nor myth. She was a mirror, reflecting the sickness of a world that had taught her power mattered more than mercy. The true victory belonged to those who refused to let her story vanish. To Lydia, to Samuel, to everyone who chose truth over comfort. Because history, when told honestly, is not a wound, it is a scar, proof of pain endured and healing begun. And so the widow's legacy did not die in 1836 or in 1936 or even now. It lives in every act of courage that dares to name the past. It lives in the river, in the soil, in the voices that once had none. And when night falls on Savannah and the moon lights the broken stones of that old estate, the air still hums with a quiet, mournful promise that the dead do not rest until the living have learned to remember them kindly.